examiners and evaluators. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Nanthini and I propose Chandra Kanthan, Matrics number 2180744, and the title of my Viva presentation today is The Evolution of the Final Girl, Representation of Women in Selected Horror Movies. Gender stereotype is a growing problem in the world, especially in the mass media. For this reason, I intend to focus on the issue of representation of women in selected horror movies. Firstly, we are going to look at one of the quotes by Mahatma Gandhi, which goes, "Of all the evils for which man has made himself responsible, none is so degrading, so shocking, or so burial as his abuse of the better half of humanity, the female sex." As for my introduction of this study, Mahatma Gandhi expressed the essence of the study on how men and media stereotype women. And for this study, how horror movies stereotype and overlooks women. The focus of this study is on how women have been portrayed in selected horror movies from the time frame of 1960s up to 2016. The findings from this study will contribute to a newly developing area of research on that makes a significant connection to the modern movie industries. I wanted to examine the genre of horror as the genre had been constantly active in movie scholarships, let alone among viewers around the world. Horror movies are widespread, discuss diverse subjects, and are important to the analysis of popular concerns, in particular women's representation. I have divided my presentation into few following areas, which I will start off with a statement of the problem in this research. For the problem statement that I like to focus on is that gender media portrayal is often an avenue for debate among media study researchers due to the presence of biasness in the portrayal of gender in movie generally. The media depicts women in a traditional gender roles in which beauty receives prominence and women are defined by the number of children and men they have in their lives. This research looks at the evolution of women to analyze if women are still depicted as victims and depend on men, or have this representation changed over the year. The next part of my Viva presentation, I'll put forward the research objectives of this study as presented. The first research objective is to examine the evolution of the themes in selected horror movies. Secondly, is to examine the evolution of women in selected horror movies. Thirdly, is to gauge the level of awareness of Malaysian on gender stereotypes in the selected horror movies, and finally is to improve the body of literature on the perception towards gender representation. Now, I like to focus on the literature review and conceptual framework of this study. In my literature review, there are three main things that I have discussed about, namely relevant theory, gender stereotyping followed by stereotyping in media. For the relevant theory, I have discussed about agenda setting theory, objectification theory, representation theory, and hypodermic needle theory. Apart from that, I have also discussed on the gender stereotype as it is derived from the disparity in the social rules both at home and at work based on social theory. I have also discussed stereotyping in media in terms of portrayal of men and women in media. To top that, I have elaborated on the images of relationship between men and women in the sense of women's dependence and men's independence, followed by women's incompetence and men's authority, and finally, women as prime caregiver and men as breadwinner. I have also stated the theoretical framework that was adopted in this study based on Laura Morley's male gaze theory. The figure above shows the conceptual framework that was adopted for this study. As shown, the independent variable is horror movie, where it plays an important role in understanding how the understanding of audience tally in the sense of gender and themes used to depict women. Whereas, the dependent variable is divided into three, namely themes, gender, and also awareness. These variables do not change and remain the same. Moving on now to methodology. This study used a blend of qualitative and quantitative method for data collection. The quantitative method was adopted to support my qualitative data in order to avoid being biased with the results. For the qualitative analysis, this study used a qualitative content analysis, which is defined as subjective interpretation of a content of the document through a systematic process of coding. For the content analysis, 6 movies were selected and analyzed. As for the time frame of the movies were selected from 1960s to 2016. 3 movies were selected respectively for each time frame. As in for the source, the movies were obtained and viewed from various websites. Looking at the quantitative analysis, in conducting this research, this study administered a survey using Google Form. For survey, the reason for using Google Form is because it is relevant, quick, and can reach intended respondents fast using social media and communication media. Moving on to the pilot study, this pilot study was conducted to fill in any gaps in the survey for the actual data collection. Lastly, sample population using Cochrane's 1977 sample size formula. About 164 respondents were needed with a margin error of 5%. Together the respondent, snowball sampling was carried out and the researcher managed to gather 200 respondents for this research. As can be seen, the diagram above depicts the research design encompassing the flow of the research with 6 consecutive stages, starting with literature review, identifying research questions, analyze movie, questionnaire distribution, data analysis, and finally, analysis of the findings. The first movie is Psycho, 1960s. The second movie is The Exorcist from 1973. The third movie is Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974. While the fourth movie is The Ring, 2002. And the fifth movie is Conjuring 2 from 2016, whereas the sixth movie is The Nun, 2018. For quantitative data analysis, because Google Form is used to create questionnaires, the findings are automatically tabulated in charts and graphs ready for the researcher to analyze the data. This study only uses descriptive analysis of the qualitative data to suit the nature of the research questions. For discussion of the findings, to answer the research question 1 and 2, a total of 5 themes were identified from the coding of selected horror movies. There are 2 sets of themes that varies from one another in terms of representation of female lead in the selected movies. To top that, in the 1960s to 1974 selected horror movies displayed a much negative theme in the term of representation of women. In the horror movies from this time frame, women were portrayed with the theme of being materialistic, sex object, scream queen, and a victim. Furthermore, the themes obtained from the selected horror movies from the time frame of 2002 to 2018 showcased a much more positive manner. These generated themes are more positive in the sense where women were portrayed as a more independent, strong, intelligent, and a person who sacrifices. For the quantitative findings, the viewers have noticed a gender bias in horror movies. Viewers also hold on to the perception where majority agreed that female often tends to play a negative role in a horror movie. Malaysians are very much aware and have sufficient knowledge of the stereotyping that is present in horror movies. The result also indicates that the respondent agreed to women being portrayed as sex objects. Female is being portrayed as a weak and pleasure-seeking character in horror movies and also as a character that usually dies and comes back to seek revenge in horror movies. Moving on to the implication of studies, movie production should give opportunity and hire more female workers to work on screen and also behind the screen. This should be done to implement the awareness of the misconception and portrayal of any gender. Female members of the audience should also emotionally separate themselves from these characters instead of being met with the inspiring role models. Laura Mullis male-gaze theory has been put forward as the main framework to carry out this study. Feminist movies theory and hypodermic needle theory should be considered in further study. Finally, to wrap up everything, we have come to the point of suggestion of further studies. For the number of horror movies, more horror movies should be included in the further studies to get the data from various period time and not limited to a certain time period as this study. Followed by the location sample is to further study on the topic to be done in various countries to gauge the level of awareness of viewers on gender stereotyping in a horror movie. In the sense of context, this study can be done on Asian horror movies and also Middle Eastern horror movies. Finally, further study researchers can also examine the perception of male respondents on the portrayal of women in movies to get a view from a different angle. Thank you. That's all from me.